Today we're going to talk about the importance of research ethics. In this talk, I will talk about the what of ethics, the why of ethics, and of course, the how of ethics. In contrast with other sciences that also deals with man, such as anthropology, which studies the origin of the human body and the development of culture, biology, man as a living organism, psychology, the process of intellect and will, and sociology, which looks at the structure and attitudes of social groups. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the moral component of human life. According to Socrates, ethics is the science of good and evil. To the Greeks, to be ethical means to be a man of character. They look at two words, moral, which comes from the Latin word mors moris, or way of life, and ethics, which comes from the Latin word ethos, which means character or custom. While sometimes we interchange these two words in English, when they look at ethics, they see it as a first level of effective communication because the ethos, the person's character, is the one that establishes credibility in all forms of communication. Therefore, if we are to apply it in ethics, for one to be an established and credible researcher, one must be ethical. In other words, we will look at the ought, what I ought to do, versus the can, what I can do. Because sometimes what we can do, we should not or we ought not to do. Why ethics? 3 basic reasons. First, it contributes to social stability. Second, it gives us a moral hierarchy. And third, it helps clarify values. What does this mean? When we say that it contributes to social stability, we are talking about the fact that ethics sets a standard of behavior. Whether or not the code of ethics exists in a particular industry, the fact is when one says or claims to be ethical, then one must try to serve the community and have the basics of honesty, of justice, of right conduct. At the same time, to have ethics means to be able to set expectations from each other and from the community. For example, how do researchers collaborate? There's a certain understanding among the researchers, as well as the researcher and his or her university or research institution. Then, of course, ethics guides our actions. It helps us decide what we ought to do in a given situation. As we said, it gives us a moral hierarchy because many times we will find that there are certain values that are conflicting. For example, we want to do a research on a particular topic with regards health. That will, of course, even if we adhere to the truth, we have to see whether or not it will harm our subjects or our respondents. Therefore, you are balancing the cost of the research versus the benefit to the people, whether or not benefit to the community and also to the subject matter. It cannot be that, yes, we will come up with a brilliant research, but then we are actually harming people. Then it also helps us defend our actions vis-a-vis the questionable behavior from others. So if we find that our colleague does not want to meet the standards of ethics, at least we can have some basis of argument of why we should carry out this particular research in this way and not that. Finally, it helps clarify values. Ethics evaluates those actions and the values that underlie them. It determines which values should be pursued or ought to be pursued and which ought not be pursued. Let's look at the how. How do we do ethics? How do we become ethical? For me, there are three overarching principles for ethical research. These are to seek the truth, to do no harm, and to be fair. First is to seek the truth. Truth is the bottom line of any research. Why research if we are not seeking the truth? And what is the truth for? It is to be able to serve the community, to serve the society when we come up with answers to questions. Of course, what is research, right? The basic of research is to ask questions. If we are not going to come up with the correct and true answers, then what is the point of our research? How do we make sure that we are seeking truth? First of all, we have to keep an open mind and not have a biased research. Sometimes when I look at the proposals of some of my students, I find that some of their research questions are phrased in such a biased form as if they are already expecting the answer. This cannot be. We have to authentically want to know the answers or discover the answers as we carry out the research, meaning we are prepared to be proven wrong in our assumptions. That is to be honest in one's research. That is to seek the truth. So there should be honesty of purpose. Why am I doing this research? What is our primary motivation in carrying out that research? Even if you are doing it for school purposes or to be able to complete your graduate program, you can really get into the research that interests you, that's something that you will be able to look back and be proud of, to be able to say that I have contributed to society with my research. Of course, needless to say that accuracy in the recording of data and its analysis is very important in research. When we talk about accuracy in recording, we look at not just actual, like if you're taping the interview or whatnot, but in the coding of the data. Is your coding correct? Do we go out of our way to make sure that we are scrupulous in analyzing the data that we have received? Let's talk about this a little bit more later. Of course, it means that we also have to use the correct statistical procedure and that it should be valid. Research that is valid means that another researcher, maybe in the future, can carry out the research as we had described it in our paper and come up with the same results using everything that we had placed there. So the validity of research is when we say that this framework can be applied to this type of situation, whether the data gathered feeds into that framework. So validity is very important. Let's go back to data accuracy. How do you achieve that? First is to pre-test the instrument. It's always very easy to take shortcuts and go right into the research phase. But sometimes, and it's something that oftentimes we can regret at the end of our research when our results do not match up. It's simply because the instrument was wrong. And so it's always good to spend a little more time to pretest the instrument to see that it generates the data that we need. Of course, this presupposes that we also use the correct statistical process. For example, having the correct sampling size. Sometimes I read papers and they say 30% of the population, cha-cha-cha-cha-cha. And you ask them, 30% of what? And sometimes their papers are very vague and not telling you the actual numbers of the respondents. And you find out 30% of 50 in a population size of, let's say, one college would be 5,000. It's just simply not mathematically correct and does not give you an accurate or a truthful accounting of the statistical values or even the results. So we have to make sure that our sampling size is correct based on what we are studying. We also have to know how to use the proper computational tools. Sometimes the lack of knowledge can lead to inaccuracy. When we're doing qualitative research, we have to be very careful that we record the responses accurately. We take note of if it's an in-depth interview that we are doing, that the questions are properly answered and that we have taken down our notes very well. And then, of course, this also implies that there will be honesty in the analysis and the interpretation of the data we have gathered. The second principle is to do no harm. So here we talk about the who of research. The who can be the researcher themselves and also the research subjects. Research, no matter if we're just doing content analysis as the basic methodology, will still entail human subjects when we get responses, for example, to comment on the results of our content analysis, or it can be very human-oriented if we're doing ethnography, which means methodologies like participant observation are very, very human-centered. And because of that, whether we like it or not, it can cause disruption or intrusion on the lives of our subjects. So it's always important to balance potential benefits of research with the potential harm to the individuals or groups we are studying. Disruption can be as minor as, for example, disrupting a class. You want to take a survey, let's say, of grade 12 students. So you would have to disrupt classes, asking permission from the teacher to take some time off from her class or his class to administer a survey. So that can be the simple type of disruption, or it could be, if you're doing ethnography, to disrupt the lives of our subjects, to be in a community where you are actually a stranger. And therefore, not only disrupting the lives of those who have consented to be studied within the community, but the community itself. Then there's the intrusion. Have we made sure that we have gotten informed consent, or is our intrusion valid in that given research? Embarrassment. This, we have to be very careful not to cause trauma, either physical or psychological trauma, on our subjects. For example, if we ask very intimate questions in a focus group discussion, We may elicit embarrassment from our subjects, or we can even cause trauma. For example, our questions trigger or the discussions trigger a memory that is very hurtful. Um, we can sometimes it's very hard to predict the kind of trauma we can cause, and therefore we have to proceed with caution. We can also affect, for example, the self-esteem of the individual um, with the questions that we ask, or perhaps if it's an evaluative kind of study, we can make a person feel inferior, or we can cause memories that trigger unhappy or even insecure memories, or make the person insecure by the kind of questions and how we are asking those questions. So, just as a precaution, first we have to get informed consent. The subjects or our respondents should know the basic reason what we are doing research, and they should be willing participants. If we are studying minors, then their guardians should be aware of that study and give you consent. So it's not enough that a minor, even if they're they're teenagers and they have a mind of their own, they cannot evaluate as well as an adult whether something is good for them or not. So it's always good to ask the guardian or the parent to consent, to know that their child is a subject or a respondent in a particular study. We have to have practical considerations depending on the sector that we are studying. Like I said, if we're studying minors, then there's a lot of precautions to take. If we're studying, let's say, victims of a crime, then they've already experienced trauma, and the last thing you want is to add to that trauma. If we're studying people with disabilities, then we have to be aware of their sensibilities of race, sensibilities of religion, sensibilities of gender. These are things that we have to take into account from the time that we draft our instrument and carry out our research. It's also good to take note of the where and when of the research. These should be something that we are prepared to spend time on. It should be something that is agreeable to our respondents, not something just because it's convenient for us. We have to think of the people that we will affect. When drafting our research and informing or getting the informed consent of our respondents, we have to explain to them what type of identity or identification they will be exposed to. Is our research, we have to differentiate between privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity, because not all our respondents can understand the difference of these three. When we say that our research, we will respect their privacy, what do we mean by that? That we will protect the individual's right to control access to their participation in the study, that we will carefully consider appropriate circumstances and settings for their participation, for when we recruit them, when we enroll them in our data collection. We make them aware that the data that we collect are only the data that is needed for the research purpose, and we do not collect data that has nothing to do with the research. When we talk about confidentiality, we are saying that we are going to protect the participants' personal identifiable data, meaning that we will ensure the participants that their identity will be kept secret, that their responses will not be disclosed to anyone outside the research team. It is only fair that we notify the participants on how the information will be stored and during and after the study. And that we have taken precautions so that there would be no breach of confidentiality in their participation. So let's look at the steps that we have to take to ensure the security and protection of the records during our research. Even carelessness of just leaving it on our desk, for example, the survey forms or the recordings of our interviews. If we had promised confidentiality, then we had to make sure that it is secure at all times. And lastly, of the three, anonymity. This means that not even you, the researcher, should be able to identify who answered what. So we protect the identity of our respondents by, when we collect the data, it's not something that can be pinpointed, that there are no personal identifiers in the collection of data, whether direct or indirect, that would allow even the research team to link the responses with the specific individuals. So data is not collected in person, and no key codes or names or identifiers are collected together with the data that we are collecting. The third principle is to be fair. What does that mean? To be fair means that at all times we are considerate of everyone involved in the research, from our colleagues to our respondents to anyone affected by our research. Basic things to think about is, first, we do not misrepresent ourselves when conducting a research. We do not pretend to be someone we're not. We do not pretend to be, we don't disguise ourselves to look like a doctor when we are collecting, for example, data from patients, let's say, waiting in the emergency room. Or we don't disguise ourselves as a substitute teacher when we want to enter a college or a classroom and get responses from students. So we always identify ourselves. We identify ourselves as researchers in the conduct of the research. Of course, there are a few exceptions here, and we can discuss this later after this short lecture. We have to give credit where credit is due. The basic thing is to cite our sources, especially in the final paper that we are writing. We have to, in the university, one of the things is that is frowned upon and that can even cause suspension or expulsion is academic dishonesty. And among this dishonesty is plagiarism. So we have to avoid that or not fall into it at all costs. And we'll talk about this a little more. And also, our research should benefit both the researchers and the participants. It cannot be a one-sided benefit. It cannot be we benefit from it, but the participants do not. They don't have to benefit it in for example, in a direct way, but there should be some benefit in society. For example, recently I participated in a research project where we studied the hindrances to the health communication of our Department of Health. So we looked into what was wrong with their communication with regards to the pandemic. Why were people not responding to the call for wearing masks or for getting vaccinated? So we studied how to improve the way that they could communicate both the health risks of the pandemic and how to avoid getting sick. Let's go back to talking about plagiarism. So there are 4 basic types. One is the direct plagiarism, when somebody claims to be the author of a paper he or she did not write at all. So, one way of doing this, and something that we've caught in some rare form, is when someone gets, for example, a paper that was done in a different language, let's say Spanish, and then they translate it in English, and then they start calling it their own paper. So a translation of somebody else's work is plagiarism, because you can only claim to have translated it, not to have written it. The lack of citation, so it's also known as source plagiarism, when we forget, and sometimes this can be done because of carelessness, simply because we forgot or did not take note of the source of that information. So we have to be very careful about taking down notes. And when we like something that we've read, for example, in our review of related literature, make sure that not only do you take down the phrase or the passage that you want to use, but also where you got it from. And then there is what you call the mosaic plagiarism, or in other words, cut paste, where within our own work, there are parts that are copied from existing papers, and it's mixed within our own work. But this is still plagiarism, because those phrases, that sentence, that paragraph does not belong to you, but belongs to the original author, and therefore should be cited properly. And lastly, self-plagiarism. This is when we present something that we had written before and maybe even published as something new. So if you've written it in, let's say, 2015, you cannot just update it and then call it new, even if you are the original author. You have to, the best thing is to simply cite yourself, put yourself in citations. Although some of the universities frown upon self-citation, especially if it's too much. Once in a while, there's so that you don't also reinvent the wheel, it's possible. But if practically 50% is self-citation, then there's something severely wrong with that research paper or project. And finally, we have to be socially responsible researchers. This means that from the get-go, in choosing a research topic, choose one that will benefit the community or society, instead of a topic that will only serve to push your career advancement. And with that, I end, and terima kasih. Please consider subscribing the bottom below.